There's less than a month left of the NBA season before we finally get to the playoffs. We've seen players break out into stardom, new teams overtaking their competitors in the standings, while some teams have had disappointing seasons which go against their expectations that they had in the offseason. Teams are currently fighting for a good position in each of their respective conferences, and even one game could cost you a favorable position going into the postseason. Some teams have a lot of pressure going into the playoffs, while some might just be happy to be there. With that being said, let's get into one or maybe two things every playoff team has to worry about heading into the postseason. I'm just going to get the Atlanta Hawks out of the way as quickly as possible. If they do happen to make it out of the play-in and make the playoffs, my biggest worry is that their small backcourt makes it very difficult to defend, and it's fairly obvious that the team has just been better when there's one point guard on the floor versus when they're both on the floor. Next is the Boston Celtics. They're a team with a lot of pressure going into the playoffs as they've been the clear-cut best team in the league this season. They're the number 1 offense and the number 2 defense, and they have a core which is undoubtedly best on paper. My overall expectations for them to make it out of the East is fairly high, so there isn't much to talk about when it comes to them. If I had to say something, it would be about how if they can make the adjustments to get to the rim more, if their shots aren't falling. This is an extremely jump shot heavy team, which makes sense considering they can basically run a 5-out offense whenever they choose to do so. They're number 1 in 3-point frequency, while being 27th in rim frequency. So the worry is that them possibly shooting themselves out of the game, and it's up to Joe Mazzulla to make sure that they don't settle and get downhill when their shots aren't falling, because we know that they can do so, especially when they shoot 70% at the rim. Next up is the Chicago Bulls. If they get out of the play-in, they need to find themselves an identity once again, which should have been on the defensive side of the ball, especially under Billy Donovan, who places a lot of emphasis on defense, though that hasn't been the case this season as they've been below average. They have been dealing with injuries across the board, so they need to find something that they excel at that they can leverage against their first opponent in the playoffs. The Cleveland Cavaliers have been dealing with injuries all throughout the season, but have managed to keep it together and maintain a top seed led by Donovan Mitchell, but also their role players stepping up when it was needed. What I am worried about is the lack of synergy between their core best players. We still haven't seen Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell work out as well as fans may have wanted them to, and them both being small guards doesn't help when it comes to the defensive side of the ball. Then you have Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen, who are both good players individually, but the lineups still look better when they have one or the other on the court, because of the fact that they can have someone like Georges Niang or Dean Wade next to them to provide better spacing. On to the Dallas Mavericks. You know what Luka and Kyrie can do for you offensively, but you need consistent play defensively. Their last 5 games, they're the number 2 ranked defense, but post All-Star break they're ranked 17th. So they have the potential to be up there defensively, but that hasn't been consistent from a night-to-night basis. When you have Derrick Jones Jr., PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, and Derek Lively, you like to see some more consistency, and we've been seeing that more lately over their past 10 games. When you put that together with their lethal offense, they're going to be an extremely dangerous team going to the playoffs if they can keep it up on both sides of the ball. The Denver Nuggets, who I have as the favorites in the West, I feel pretty confident about. Their main worry would be the non-Jokic minutes, because they can be very vulnerable without both his playmaking and scoring abilities. It may be more difficult for them to maintain leads when he's not on the court in the playoffs, but you also have to keep in mind that they'll probably be playing him near 40 minutes each game, so maybe that won't be too much of a problem as they'll likely stagger Jamal Murray and MPJ minutes when Jokic is off the floor. But even then, the offense is still stagnant at times. There's the fact that Christian Braun hasn't necessarily taken the scoring leap he may have wanted with Bruce Brown gone, and everyone else is relatively solid, but their bench isn't very score heavy, and they have to rely on their starters more often than not. The Golden State Warriors, who are actually on the verge of possibly falling out of the play-in and have had a very up and down season, not only because of injuries and suspensions, but because of the inconsistency of their players. If they do happen to make the playoffs, not only is consistency key, but finding that second option behind Steph is absolutely essential, whether it ends up being Klay or Kuminga who can produce at a high level for consecutive games, because if not, everything would be lost. And we haven't necessarily seen that second option this season. Some games it's Clay, sometimes it's Kuminga, sometimes it may even be Brandon Podziemski. So they definitely have to figure this out within the next few games. Speaking of the Golden State Warriors, the Houston Rockets are right there when it comes to stealing the 10th seed from them by the time the season ends. If they make the playoffs, I'd assume Alfred Sengun will be back by then, so the focus should be how they can seamlessly integrate him back into the lineup while keeping up their defensive tenacity, but also the offensive outbursts they've had during their current win streak. Moving on to the Indiana Pacers, they traded for Pascal Siakam, and since then they've been okay. When they've had both him and Tyrese together, they're just barely above 500 with a record of 15-14, but you do have to keep in mind that some of these games were right after Tyrese came back from his injury and was on a minutes restriction. While they haven't necessarily taken the jump that they may have wanted after trading for Siakam, there have been some improvements in defense as they've been above average since the deadline. The positives in the Siakam trade is the fact that you have a second creator next to Haliburton to relieve some of the offensive pressure off of him. You still have good shooters on the team, so you can also only hope that they can sustain their offensive play in the playoffs, where opposing teams will be game planning against them in a 7-game series. The Los Angeles Clippers are a team that was extremely hot going into the All-Star break thanks to their hot shooting and them being an above average defense. Post All-Star break, they're still a top 10 offense, but have been one of the worst defenses in the NBA. Their biggest worry come playoff time is honestly Paul George and James Harden. In order to make a run in the playoffs this year, you really need consistent play from both of them. Both of them have had some really rough patches throughout the season where they're not necessarily playing at the level that you need to be championship contenders. When they were, they looked like one of the best teams in the league. You know that Kawhi will give you consistent superstar play, but they won't have enough if their two other best players don't step up come playoff time. And it reminds me of when Kawhi talked about the team relying on talent, because they're not a team that can get by and win consecutive games when their best players aren't playing well. They're a team that already doesn't get to the rim very much and relies on both mid-range and threes, which can result in inconsistencies and struggles if the shot isn't falling, and teams can then run them off of the three-point line and force them to beat them another way. With the other team in LA, the Lakers, finding a consistent lineup is vital for them, especially since at this point of the season, guys have been in and out of the starting lineup, and injuries have also piled up. We don't know when Jared Vanderbilt will be back, but Gabe Vincent is coming back very soon, and you'd like to build a defensive lineup that's good enough to keep D'Lo on the court so that he doesn't get targeted and eventually played off the court like he was last year against the Nuggets, because he largely contributed in their wins against the Grizzlies and the Warriors. The Miami Heat are an interesting team to gauge, partially because of the fact that you never really know what you're going to get from them in the regular season, and because they've been one of the more injured teams, which is similar to how they were last year. Their most played lineup doesn't even have 300 possessions played, which is significantly less than most other teams. This is why you can at most hope for good health coming into the playoffs, or Jimmy Butler playing at a superstar level once again, though I don't really think you should be relying on making a run every season, especially when the run to the finals last year almost never happens. There's also the starting lineup to think about, whether you're starting both Rozier and Hero, because the Heat are a grit and grind type of team that makes opposing offenses work, and this compensates for the lack of three-point volume when they can hold teams to low-scoring games. Onto the Milwaukee Bucks. A lot of the worries that they had at the start of the season have pretty much dissipated as the season's progressed. They struggled heavily defensively, but have started moving towards being a somewhat average defense, and Dame is starting to look more like his usual self. If there was a worry, it had to be them getting their best lineup back. Their best lineup includes Dame, Malik Beasley, Chris Middleton, Giannis, and Brook Lopez, a lineup with a net rating of 16. The only concern I have for that lineup is having both Dame and Malik Beasley as your defensive backcourt. Dame is less of a concern defensively because he can hold his own, but Malik Beasley hasn't been that good defensively at all. There's a lot of lack of athleticism in their lineup as well, considering that they're one of the oldest teams in the league, But despite that, minutes from young athletic guys like Marjon and Andre Jackson Jr. haven't been there, so you have to think about whether their defense can hold up in the playoffs based on who they're matched up against. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, they're in an unfortunate situation where we're not even sure whether Karl-Anthony Towns will be back for the playoffs. And even if he is, he likely won't be 100%. The thing about the Timberwolves is that they're an extremely good defense, but the offense is questionable at times, and you have to wonder whether the defense will be enough to win with the lack of shot creators on the roster. This lack of shot creation can make their offense extremely predictable, especially down the stretch when teams can pretty much guess that they're going to try to get the ball into Anthony Edwards' hands. The New Orleans Pelicans going to the playoffs are one of the teams in the West that I feel pretty confident about all around. I say that finding their most optimal lineup is the most important thing for them coming into the postseason. If they go up against a smaller team like the Clippers, they could go a small ball with Larry Nance Jr. or Zion at the 5, but if they go against a bigger team, they could struggle there. The Pelicans play very good team defense when you talk about defending the perimeter, but once teams get inside, that's where they struggle since Jonas Valanciunas isn't that good of a rim protector. Teams also target him on switches, especially in pick and roll situations where he becomes very vulnerable and teams can easily take advantage of the situation and get downhill. The New York Knicks. When healthy, you could argue that they have the most depth in the league, but they haven't been for most of the season, and we still haven't heard much about Julius Randle returning, along with OG Anunoby's injury flaring up again. The defense has been theirs, which is really nice to see, but the offense is so heavily reliant on Jalen Brunson creating scoring opportunities for his teammates, along with guys like Dante DiVincenzo getting hot and hitting their shots. For example, I think that the Heat would be a bad matchup for them because not only can they lock in on defense and force the ball out of Brunson's hands, but they have more variety when it comes to creation power. I think that it's extremely important that they can get Randle back for the playoffs since he's another great creator that has an excellent in and out game. The Oklahoma City Thunder, who are next, have a center problem. At the current moment, they don't have anyone that can hang with any strong and aggressive bigs, and that's what's contributed to them being one of the worst rebounding teams in the league. They're 29th in offensive rebounds per game, though they're pretty average when it comes to defensive rebounding. They're extremely small once Chet comes out of the game as well, where they have to bring in Jalen Williams who's 6'9", and you can see why some people favor the Lakers in a potential matchup against them with AD at the 5. They'll have to send more bodies to help Chet on AD, and this will open up the offense for the Lakers for kick-out opportunities or cuts to the basket. The Orlando Magic. They're a team with a lot of size and disruptive defenders like Jalen Suggs, who can not only guard on ball, but also chase players off screens with excellent mobility that's needed to close out on threes, and Jonathan Isaac, who's elite whether it's guarding both perimeter and the paint. So there isn't much of a problem in that end, but there's a complete hole when it comes to the offensive side of the ball, and that's the fact that they lack a starting point guard. For most of the season, we've seen Jalen Suggs take on that challenge to be the point guard, but a lot of the offense still runs through Paolo, and while he's been a good playmaker, especially since he's shown a lot of improvement since his rookie year, you can see how valuable a playmaking guard would be for the team. Their half-court offense is often stagnant, and they're forced to take a lot of contested shots, and it doesn't help that they just suck at three-point shooting in general. So while they're one of the best defensive teams, what I'm concerned about is their ability to consistently formulate their offense over the course of a playoff series. For the Philadelphia 76ers, I don't really have much to say about them. They've been able to pull out some wins, and they're still able to fight for their top 6 seed, but without Joel Embiid, they've been a pretty tough watch, and I have absolutely no confidence in them in the playoffs without Embiid, but if he does return, even though I don't think he'll be 100%, they could possibly make some noise. The Phoenix Suns have been a very confusing team this season, and what I think needs to be addressed before the playoffs is their fourth quarter scoring. Overall, they have the worst net rating in the fourth quarter at -14, and they're nearly 8 points worse than the 29th ranked team. This includes them having the worst offensive rating and third worst defensive rating. Post All-Star break, they have a -8 net rating in the clutch, which is improvement, but it's still surprising that a team of Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal are this bad in fourth quarter situations. While I can somewhat understand it defensively, for them to struggle to this extent offensively is a major problem that they need to fix come playoff time. The last team I want to talk about is the Sacramento Kings. Coming out of the All-Star break, the defense has been looking much better than before, and part of it can be attributed to the emergence of Keelan Ellis, a tenacious defender who excels at help defense, along with closing in small gaps to poke the ball free from offensive players. Team defense is so important, especially for teams like this that don't have many good defenders like the Kings. They need those main defensive guys who can rotate well and communicate with one another to help lead the team. With the Kings, that can work with Keon Ellis and Keegan Murray. What will be key for them in the playoffs is if this defense they've been playing recently is real. Playoffs. Only a few months left until then, and I'm excited for what's to come. If you have any thoughts on a specific team or player, leave them down below, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.